think to kick off the Q&A session, once again, I'd like to encourage you to keep the questions and comments coming in the chat function. We've had a few interesting ones come through. Dr. Naughton, I'd like you to kick us off. And there's two questions. Firstly, and I think you did go into this, but what constitutes better washing? And then secondly, we look currently, pouches are used to refill HDPE, PET detergent pouches. Should we not be pushing for pouches as replacements to HDPE and PET bottles? And we always think of those Sunlight detergent refills that are just slightly cheaper. Should we not be thinking about going in that direction based on what we know?
Okay, thanks. So to the first one, well, washing, it often is the energy in the heating the water. So actually what it comes down to, especially if it's carbon footprint. And interestingly, it's dishwashers are, especially if they're modern dishwashers, they're really efficient. So actually, those TV ads are true. Washing in a dishwasher actually saves you money because they're energy efficient, relative to actually heat, filling its sink of water, especially if it's hot water. So it's if a consumer is hand washing, so this is true in textiles, sort of clothing, and in cups and any sort of reusable thing. If it's hand washing, generally looks poor unless it's hand washing in cold water, in which case it can look all right. And then the other different thing is the energy mix of the country. So certainly in South Africa, if we have hot water from our grid, if it's on, then it is very carbon intensive. If you have a solar geyser, then absolutely, then actually your washing is efficient, even if you're hand washing in hot water. So as it is with so many things, it is really the context that points it out. But it's the energy intensity of the electricity primarily, I'd say.
On the second point?
On the second point, absolutely. I mean, I think the Apple study just showed now that the pouch, just purely because of its weight, is the best environmental option. It's like I said in the meta-studies, one of the overarching findings that you can draw out is that lighter weight is always better. So, and interestingly, we did this also for milk packaging. The milk sachet, which is, I'm not sure if it's even still on the market, but the milk sachet actually comes out as the lowest packaging because it's the lightest compared with an HDPE bottle, and certainly compared with a carton or anything else. So it's the same mechanism at play with the detergents. But when you look at the LCA, a large number of those milk sachets get damaged and burst. And then, so when you look at the LCA, the full, all the way milk, all the way to actually what gets to the consumer, the sachet actually comes out poorest because it's got the highest losses. And what I tried to show was all the impacts, or most of the impacts, are actually occurring in the milk. So you're really wanting to save the milk. It's actually not only about how light that packaging is. That's possibly less with the detergents. I haven't worked particularly on the detergent pouches, so I don't know if they have higher losses than perhaps the bottles. But I think critically with the pouches, what's not being taken into account there, it's only the materials, and we're not looking at the end of life. So pouches aren't recycled. I think there are probably more knowledgeable people in this audience that may take me to task there. But certainly pouches with the laminates, the multiple plastics, they aren't easily recycled, and in most countries they're not preferred purely because they're not. If you have a circular indicator, and if you're looking at resource use, then they don't come out the best. So on a carbon footprint, they come out the best because they're the lightest. On a sort of resource use, they come out the poorest because they aren't recyclable. So it's not only around recycled content, it's actually also about recyclability, and I think that's not being taken in. And certainly the end of life there is really important. So if you have a pouch on a sort of a European market and it's being incinerated and there's energy recovery from that plastic waste, then it will indeed look like quite a strong player, perhaps. But here our pouches would be landfilled because they're not being recycled.
Well, I think what it does demonstrate.
So and the imported. Okay, interesting.
And what it also does demonstrate is, once again, taking an holistic view. To your point on Eskom, there is at least a man who understands the packaging industry at the helm now, so I'm sure he's doing everything he can to ensure that the lights do remain on at this stage. Linda, I'd like to pose the next question to you. And you looked at recycled content in your study, but did the study look at recyclability possibilities per se?
Yeah, I also pointed out that we also included the end-of-life phase. And it was really interesting because we did our study for 10 countries all around the globe. And we could see really from the different countries how the waste management is, and also how the figures for the recycling process changed there. So what just Philippa said was absolutely correct. The recycling of a pouch in Europe, or especially we also did the case study in Austria, because we, like I mentioned in the presentation, we're an Austrian-based company, and we don't have landfilling in Austria. So the LCA looked even better in Austria for the pouch than for like the examples showed in South Africa. But I also want to mention one further point, which has not really that much to do with the environmental aspect, but with the human aspect, meaning the handling. So we also have to make sure that people like the handling of a product. So with the pouch, as it is a very light packaging, some people don't like the handling of that, especially when it comes to maybe elderly people or handicapped people. For them, the handling gets really tricky. For them, again, a rigid packaging is more interesting. So we cannot just look for the environmental aspects from the packaging. We also need to look on the handling for the consumers.
But and Harro, to bring you in on this point, to your study and particularly your PhD students' findings on the beach, the fact that we're seeing all of these bottle lids wash up on the beach does speak to a product design, product manufacturing soluble challenge. Surely consumers wouldn't be averse to having a lid that's somehow attached to the bottle to stop that kind of thing from happening. How much of your research is now finding its way into this conversation around how we redesign packaging and make it fit for purpose to ensure that we don't see a lot of the plastics end up in the environment?
Thank you very much. How much of an impact does our research have in the conversation? The audience is maybe better placed than I am, but yeah, we've had some robust engagements with industry players on this work that we've been trying to put together. I think a lot of it's still in progress, but yeah, Dr. Chitaka's work certainly has received a significant amount of attention, both academically and in industry circles, from what I could gauge in the last while. And yeah, that for us as a university is very important, that we're not just in the ivory tower. Of course, we work to produce the human talent for this green economy and the circular economy. But we're also doing cutting-edge research, hopefully, that is going to be adopted by players in the industry.
And then just another question to you, Harro, on looking at the carbon footprint of the industry, and you really look quite holistically at this. When you look at your dashboards, could you go in and then model the impact of, say, reducing reliance on fossil fuels to power industrial processes? And I'm thinking here of Safripol's strategic goal to introduce greater renewables in its operations, and then how that would feed back into the overall carbon footprint.
Yeah, that's straightforward. That can be done quite easily in a life cycle model, and the answer there is really straightforward. If you replace your main energy source with one that has a 20 times lower carbon footprint per unit of energy, the life cycle is going to look much greener. So we know we have to do that. I like to say that a circular economy, will only have a low environmental impact if it's drawing largely on renewable and low impact energy sources. We can't build a circular economy on the back of a carbon-based electricity system. And that's because we need energy to move things back around the cycle. They don't move by themselves. It does take work and energy to move things. And if that energy is a high impact energy, then we might better stay with a linear system than go to a circular one. We have to have lots of low impact energy in a circular economy.
And if what we're seeing through the life cycle analysis and what you've just said leads to two conclusions effectively, that the levers in the control of the plastics manufacturing industry are that to reduce their carbon footprint, they need to start relying a lot more on renewable sources of fuel. But also, the other big issue is how to stop plastics from entering into the environment, because the life cycle analysis has shown that overall, this is probably the better way to be packaging our foods and everything else. The big problem still is how that waste is ending up in the environment. What would you be advising the industry to focus on in terms of goals and ways to ensure that it can reduce that leg?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. And so distinguishing how plastic enters the environment and where is really essential, so that the industry can strategically decide what is worth fighting for and what not. I'd like to say fighting for every last straw may be a silly thing to do when the consumers have decided they don't want straws that are throwaway and end up on the beaches. So understanding where the plastic enters the environment, where you can prevent that through better recycling, better system design, and where not. In many countries, the divide between your urban-based consumers and your rural consumers is very important in that respect. In the urban system, really, we have to get the municipalities up to a space where the waste can be collected or the materials can be collected, the resources can be returned to the system. And that has to be an interplay between the municipalities and extended producer responsibility. But when you then move into deep rural areas or onto remote islands in Indonesia, it may be very difficult to get that material back all the way. Very encouraging project that Safripol showed us from Mpumalanga to get the PET bottles back, but it's not always going to be possible to get the stuff back out of the deep rural. So you may have to think about abandoning a plastic sort of packaging in areas where it's not going to be possible to recover the resource.
I think that's an interesting point. And Dr. Naughton, to your point as well earlier about being contextually specific, it would be lovely if everyone in South Africa could afford a dishwashing machine to wash efficiently, but that just isn't the context that we find ourselves in South Africa. So these solutions also need to be very mindful of the current conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what I was trying really to show with that kind of complicated graphic. But it really is the context. You can't make sweeping conclusions on which material is better, even actually if single-use or reusable is better. It's that variable within the context. So I think, whether, like Harold was talking about, rural, but also island nations are a big one with the single-use plastics, where actually reusables have to be the option, because it's not possible to have viable recycling industries if you're a small tourist-led island nation. And those studies done there show very clearly that you need refillable water bottles. You must, single-use plastic water bottles just don't work, whereas in a city works like here, if it's going to be recycled, it's got high value, it's creating value and jobs, then absolutely a single-use plastic bottle is the right choice. So it's very much the context, which doesn't help because it just makes it complicated.
It does, well, life is complicated. We're South Africans, we're used to complication. Last question. Considering what we saw from your study in particular, should there not be an even higher push to plant-based food consumption, looking at the CO2 contributions of animal farming in particular, and it is this perennial conversation?
Yeah, I think that's less contentious than whether it should be packaged in bioplastic or fossil plastic, is that you should be eating more plant-based. That's a fairly easy one, yeah.
And that's really where a lot of the attention should be focused. And why back to our perceptions as consumers are often driven in the echo chambers of social media and not really informed by the science. So I guess that's the challenge now for the industry. How does it go and redirect the conversation around the evidence and the science, and not some of the environmental folklore that we do see in social media as well? On that point, we've reached the end of our Q&A session. Thank you very much, Dr. Naughton, Professor Harro von Blochnitz, and Linda Stabe as well, for your contributions and for stimulating the grey matter. We're going to break now until 11 o'clock, and we'll continue this conversation around consumer perspectives, perceptions maybe on plastics, and a very interesting talk that's lined up after the break. We'll see you back here at 11.